Nobody talks about this version of the 1970s. Not the disco version, not the muscle car version, not the version with lava lamps and peace signs. There was another America in the 1970s, and millions of people lived in it. An America where dinner was whatever could stretch until Friday, where the heat got shut off in January, where kids wore shoes with cardboard stuffed inside to cover the holes. And if someone grew up in that world, they never forgot what it felt like. This was a time when inflation was destroying household budgets. Factory jobs that had kept families afloat for a generation were starting to disappear. The oil crisis made everything more expensive overnight. And for families already living on the edge, the 1970s pushed them closer to falling off entirely. Food stamps, welfare lines, and government cheese became part of daily reality for millions. The American dream was thriving on television, but in certain neighborhoods, in certain towns, that dream looked very far away. Let's walk through what daily life actually felt like for lower-class Americans during this decade. Some of this might stir memories. Some of it might reveal a side of the 1970s that rarely gets talked about. Let's step into that world. For lower-class families in the 1970s, home was not a split-level ranch in the suburbs. Home was a cramped apartment in a housing project, a rented duplex with peeling paint, or a small frame house that needed repairs nobody could afford. Public housing complexes in cities like Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, and New York housed hundreds of thousands of families. These buildings were often poorly maintained. Elevators broke down and stayed broken. Hallways smelled like industrial cleaner if they were cleaned at all. The walls were cinder block, painted a flat institutional color. Heating was unreliable. In winter, families would open the oven door and turn it on to warm the kitchen. Kids slept in their coats, blankets were piled high, hot water was inconsistent. A warm bath was never guaranteed. In rural areas, lower-class life had its own hardships. Families lived in trailers or small wooden houses with thin walls that did little against summer heat or winter cold. Indoor plumbing was not universal in the poorest parts of Appalachia and the Deep South. Outhouses still existed in some areas well into the decade. Roofs leaked, floors sagged, and the money to fix anything simply was not there. The furniture was secondhand or handed down. Couches had permanent sags. Kitchen tables wobbled on uneven legs. Appliances were kept running long past their expected life because replacing them was out of the question. The refrigerator hummed loud enough to hear from across the house. When it finally died, food went into a cooler with ice until someone could find a used replacement. Feeding a family on a lower-class income in the 1970s required creativity and sacrifice. Mothers, and it was almost always mothers managing this, learned to stretch every dollar. Beans and rice, powdered milk mixed with water, bread with margarine for breakfast, bologna sandwiches on white bread for lunch. Dinner might be a pot of soup made from whatever was available, stretched with extra water and crackers on the side. Ground beef was the luxury protein, used in casseroles and hamburger dishes that could feed a family of 5 for a couple of dollars. Commodity food programs distributed government surplus items, blocks of processed cheese, canned meat, powdered eggs, and bags of dried beans. Families would stand in long lines at distribution centers to collect these supplies. There was no pretending it was anything other than what it was. But it kept people fed. Food stamps became a larger part of life during the 1970s. The program expanded significantly during the decade, and millions of families depended on them. Using food stamps at the grocery store carried a stigma. Cashiers and other shoppers sometimes made their disapproval obvious. Children learned early to feel ashamed of something that was keeping them alive. Before we continue with the work, education, and daily struggles that define this experience, If you are enjoying this honest look at how Americans really lived and want to explore more decades and untold stories, consider subscribing. There is so much more history to uncover about the lives people actually led. Work for lower-class Americans in the 1970s was grueling, unpredictable, and poorly paid. Factory jobs that had provided stable incomes in the 1950s and the 1960s were beginning to vanish. Plants closed in the Rust Belt. Steel workers in Pittsburgh, auto workers in Detroit, and textile workers in the Carolinas watched their livelihoods disappear. The jobs that remained were often minimum wage. In 1970, the federal minimum wage was $1.60 an hour. By the end of the decade, it had risen to $2.90 an hour, but inflation ate up those gains and then some. People worked as janitors, dishwashers, gas station attendants, and warehouse laborers. Women worked as waitresses, laundry workers, hotel maids, and in sewing factories. Many lower-class families had 2 or even 3 jobs between the parents and still could not get ahead. Paychecks arrived on Friday and were spent by Monday. There was no savings account, no retirement plan, no safety net beyond the next paycheck. When someone lost a job, the consequences were immediate. Rent went unpaid. The phone was disconnected. Groceries grew thinner. For many families, the unemployment office became a familiar place. Long lines of men and women waited to file claims, filled out paperwork, and hoped for something to come through. Informal work filled the gaps. People took under-the-table cash jobs, collected scrap metal, and fixed cars in driveways for neighbors. They did whatever they could. Children growing up in lower-class households in the 1970s experienced a childhood that looked nothing like what appeared on television. While the Brady Bunch lived in a spacious house with a housekeeper, millions of American kids shared bedrooms with 3 or 4 siblings. Clothes were handed down from older brothers and sisters or picked up at church donation bins. New shoes at the start of the school year were an event, and they had to last the entire year. School was where the divide became painfully visible. Wealthier kids had new clothes, packed lunches with brand-name snacks, and money for the book fair. Lower-class kids wore the same few outfits on rotation. Free lunch in the cafeteria meant standing in a separate line that everyone could see. The embarrassment was constant and quietly devastating. But children adapted the way children do. They played outside because it was free. Stickball in the alley, tag in the parking lot, riding bikes held together with tape and spare parts. Creativity came from necessity. Toys were often homemade or improvised. A cardboard box became a fort. A stick became a sword. Imagination filled in what money could not provide. Healthcare for lower-class families was essentially crisis management. There was no health insurance for most low-wage workers. Medicaid existed, but navigating the system was difficult, and not everyone who qualified managed to enroll. Going to the doctor meant something was seriously wrong. Minor illnesses were treated at home with aspirin, rest, and hope. Dental care was almost non-existent. Toothaches were endured until they became unbearable, and then a tooth was pulled rather than filled because pulling was cheaper. Emergency rooms became the primary care provider for many families. The bills would arrive later and pile up on the kitchen counter, unpaid and unpayable. Transportation for lower-class Americans was another daily challenge. Car ownership was possible, but barely. The family car, if there was one, was old, unreliable, and constantly needing repair. Bald tires, leaking transmissions, engines that needed coaxing to start. Men spent weekends under the hood keeping cars running through sheer determination and junkyard parts. When the 1973 oil crisis hit and gas prices nearly doubled, families that were already stretching every cent faced an impossible choice between gas in the car and food on the table. In cities, public transportation was the lifeline. Buses carried workers to jobs across town. The routes were often slow, requiring transfers and long waits. A commute that took 20 minutes by car could take over an hour by bus. Missing the bus meant being late for work, and being late for work meant risking the job that was keeping everything together. Despite all of this, there was community in lower-class neighborhoods that is difficult to explain to anyone who is not there. Neighbors looked out for each other because no one else was going to. A woman down the hall would watch the children while a mother worked a late shift. A man next door would help fix the plumbing because calling a plumber was not an option. Churches provided meals, clothing donations, and a sense of belonging that extended beyond Sunday morning. Block parties and cookouts happened in the summer, with everyone contributing what they could. Children ran through open fire hydrants on hot days in the city. Porches served as gathering places where adults talked and kept an eye on the street. The late 1970s brought more economic pain. Stagflation, the combination of high inflation and stagnant wages, squeezed lower-class families harder than anyone. The cost of groceries, rent, and utilities climbed while paychecks stayed flat. By the time the decade ended, many lower-class Americans felt like the country had moved forward without them. The suburbs were booming. Shopping malls were expanding. Television showed a prosperous America that bore little resemblance to their daily reality. What defined lower-class life in the 1970s was endurance. People got up every day, went to work, fed their families, and kept going because stopping was not an option. There was no glamour in it. There was no nostalgia industry built around it. But there was a toughness and a dignity in how people survived, in how they held families together with almost nothing, in how they found moments of joy in a life that offered very few easy ones. For those who lived it, the 1970s were not about disco or muscle cars. They were about making it through another week. And for those with memories of this era, there is always more history to explore.